Well, good afternoon. My name is Bill Purcell, and I'm the director of the Institute of Politics, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you here this afternoon to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. Today, as I think we all know, is the 8th anniversary of the attacks that occurred in this country on September 11, 2001. It is a day that I am confident no one in this room will ever forget. If you would join me now in a brief moment of silence in honor of those who lost their lives in New York City, the Pentagon, and Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Thank you. This afternoon's moderator is Professor Graham Allison. Graham Allison is the director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs and the Douglas Dillon Professor of Government at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. But for us, I think, Graham Allison really is the founding father of this modern Kennedy School. He served as our dean from 1977 to 1989 and took a small, much smaller, and I think undefined program, grew it 20-fold, and that's a conservative estimate. Most importantly, he made it what it is in so many ways today. A major, I like to think the major, professional school of public policy and government in this country and in this world. He's currently working on a congressionally appointed bipartisan commission on prevention of weapons of mass destruction, proliferation, and terrorism. He is the ideal person to moderate this important discussion this afternoon. Please join me in welcoming Professor Graham Allison.
Thank you very much, Bill, and it's a great honor today to welcome to the forum two outstanding ambassadors. It's rare to have one ambassador. It's extremely rare to have two ambassadors, and to have two ambassadors, one from Korea to the U.S. and one from the U.S. to Korea, is a unique opportunity for us. So this will be a great occasion, and we want to say how pleased we are that the two ambassadors have joined us. The U.S.-South Korean relationship is one of the most important bilateral relationships in the world. In 1950, when North Korea invaded South Korea, with a green light from Stalin and Mao, President Harry Truman decided that the U.S. would come to the defense of South Korea. The U.S. and South Korea fought a bloody war over 3 years in which more than 36,000 Americans died. U.S. troops advanced to the border with China, triggering China's entry into the war, a war which ended with a truce along the 38th parallel and the so-called DMZ, the demilitarized zone, that separates North and South Korea today. Today, this afternoon, there are 28,000 Americans stationed, 28,000 military men and women stationed in South Korea as part of the U.S.-South Korean Mutual Defense Treaty, supporting what is one of the great pillars of stability in Northeast Asia. So there's a huge amount to talk about today. And we have two people that we're lucky to have to listen to and to engage in trying to understand better the relationship between U.S. and South Korea and the dangers and opportunities that both face, especially in this region. The plan for this afternoon is that I'll serve as moderator for the initial conversation, basically trying to stimulate a conversation with the two ambassadors about some of the topics that I think would be most interesting to us here locally. And I'll then open the conversation to the audience, in which members of the audience will have an opportunity to ask any question that they would like to that's related to our topic today. But it can go everything from the question of North Korean nuclear weapons to, well, what is it like to be an ambassador? but professionally related questions, as long as they're brief. So no speeches today. And after that, we'll close, and that's the game plan. Let me begin by introducing our two guests. First, the South Korea's distinguished ambassador to the United States, Duksun Han. He has been the ambassador to the U.S. since May of 2009, so new to his job. But prior to that was Prime Minister of South Korea, and prior to that had a very distinguished career in Korea over several decades, playing an important role in the modernization of South Korea's economy. Here locally, his greatest claim to fame is we're so proud that he's a Harvard PhD in economics. So let's say welcome to Ambassador. As evidence of the U.S. government's judgment about the importance of South Korea and the South Korean relationship, as an American, I would say I'm proud that we're also extremely well represented in South Korea, and our ambassador is Kathleen Stevens. Kathleen is a career foreign service officer in her job just before she went to Korea, where she's been since September of 2008. She was the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs in the Department of State. She's had many other important postings that you can see in the brochure that's been handed out, but two things to underline. She was a Peace Corps volunteer in her first post-college incarnation, and we're very proud that she's got a master's degree from here at Harvard. So let's say welcome to Kathleen. I also want to recognize, we have many distinguished guests, but I wanted to recognize we have two special guests here. Ambassador Jack Pritchard, who's the president of the Korean Economic Institute, and Jack is right here. And South Korea's Consul General here in Boston, Jun-Sak Kim, who is here. I won't go around the rest of the room because if I did, we won't have time for the conversation. So to start with, I'm going to try to talk about try to get us to talk together about three topics. One is the relationship between South Korea and Japan. Between South Korea and the United States. Yes. Excuse me. Between South Korea and the United States. Secondly, about North Korea and the question of how dangerous North Korea might actually be in the extreme. And third, I want to get us to talk a little bit about meeting North Korea's nuclear challenge, one of the topics of local interest here, and whether there's some lessons from our performance in the recent past that might be instructive for us as we think about a new Obama administration and a relatively new administration in South Korea, repositioning in dealing with the nuclear challenge. First on the relationship, just to set the context 1 second. In June, President Obama described the Republic of Korea as, quote, one of America's closest allies. On that occasion, he noted that, quote, our friendship has been forged through a history of shared sacrifice and is anchored in our shared democratic values. President Lee and Obama worked together to deepen and thicken this relationship and have committed themselves and the two countries to a, quote, sustained strategic partnership on the full range of global challenges that we're facing, from economic development to our support for democracy and human rights, from non-proliferation to counter-proliferation and peacekeeping, close quote. President Lee hailed the June meeting with President Obama as a, quote, meaningful and very significant day for the Korean-U.S. alliance of really upgrading to a new plateau of our relationship and our partnership. So this is it's almost impossible to avoid as a softball to say what's special about the U.S. South Korean relationship, and we know there's many special things, and how good is it, and we know it's extremely good. But I'd get you to stretch a little further and say, imagine just in the unlikely possibility, we're back here 4 years from now, and the relationship has soured to some significant degree. What could have happened that might have led to that souring, or what are risks to the relationship that we should be thinking about? Because it's a thick relationship, it's a tight relationship, but no relationship should be taken for granted. So it's a genuine question. I don't know if Kathleen, if you would like to begin, is it okay? Or please.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Allison. And I have to say, first of all, I'm so grateful to be here today. I've spent some time in this room myself, and I'm so honored to be here. You asked what makes the relationship special, and it may be a softball, but it's a very deeply felt conviction to me that it's a very special relationship. And I was reminded of that this morning when Ambassador Han and I went to the Korean War Memorial in Charlestown and met some Korean War veterans there. And we each laid a wreath in memory of their service and the sacrifice of 37,000 Americans in defense of the Republic of Korea. And as we commemorate September 11th. And if I may also say while I'm in this room, just in terms of introductory comments, I've been in Korea for about a year. It's my third time in Korea, so I've seen the specialness of this relationship through several iterations. But last year, when I had my confirmation hearing before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I was introduced by Senator Edward Kennedy. Now, I'm not from Massachusetts, but I was so honored, and I cannot come to the Kennedy School without saying how all of us have our stories about Senator Kennedy. But maybe not too many people know that he really cared about the U.S.-Korea relationship, and he also really cared about U.S. diplomacy, and it will forever be a highlight and a great memory of my life that he came to talk about the relationship on the day of my confirmation hearing. The U.S.-Korea relationship goes back a long time. We don't have time for all the history, but just to be anecdotal about it, you know, when Korea was first in the late 19th century struggling with how to adapt to the West, which was beginning to make itself felt in East Asia, and there's some great books written by Harvard professors about those challenges. It was called the Hermit Kingdom. The Korean king at that time made a decision that the first Western power that he was going to reach out to and establish diplomatic relations with was the United States. And the first country that was going to be permitted to buy land in Seoul for a diplomatic mission was the United States. That's where I live right now. There's a lot of continuity in this relationship. Now, it hasn't been 130 years of sweetness and light. There have been a lot of ups and downs, and there will probably be some more to come. But it is a very important relationship in the eyes of the Koreans from their very first time of thinking about how to deal with the outside world. And then, of course, we have the Korean War. By the time I got to Korea in 1975, the Korean War had been over for about 20 years, but Korea was still a very poor place. And one of the first phrases I learned in Korean, I had to go home and look it up in my dictionary, was the phrase 혈맹관계, a relationship forged in blood. So what makes it special? That's what made it special then, and people haven't forgotten that. But the relationship now is so much broader, even than that very, very deep sense of shared sacrifice and shared objectives. Now we have this huge economic relationship. We have an enormous people-to-people relationship represented by many people here in this room. You know, when I first went to Korea, again, not to be too personal about it, but in the 70s, I was the first foreigner that most Koreans in my town had ever seen. And I have some other people who were there around the same time in the Peace Corps who remember the same thing. Some of them never got over the shock of seeing a foreigner like me. And very few Koreans could get a passport or foreign currency to go overseas. Now what do we have? 1.5 million, 2 million Korean Americans. This intense social, economic ties, a visa waiver program that allows Koreans to travel back and forth freely. But now, more than ever, because of Korea's, not only its economic success, but because of its very successful democracy. Successful democracies look noisy and irritating sometimes, and by those standards, you could say Korea is very successful. Every part of the political spectrum has held power, has overcome crises, economic crises, political crises, and worked successfully with the United States. And with that, right now we have a relationship where we work not just in the region on issues like North Korea, but throughout the world. Iraq, Afghanistan, the Gulf of Aden, in our development projects throughout the world. So I think we're actually at a point where this relationship is at a new level. We're really taking it to a new level where, whether it's the financial crisis or low energy conservation and environment, all the global challenges we face, we find we have a very natural partner and a very willing and capable partner in the Republic of Korea.
Sir.
Well, the Korea-U.S. relations is special, but I would like to go back into late 90s. That is, there was a very famous scholar called Park Kyu-soo. At that time, the world was actually in somewhat imperialistic, global environments. But there was that famous scholar actually mentioned about United States at that time. He said that United States is a most fair-minded country. So it is quite fitting for United States to arbitrate the world affairs. And it is the most affluent country among 6 continents. It was the perception in the late 90s. And because at that imperialistic environments, United States is free of any desire for territorial expansion. I don't know how should we perceive from current perspective, but it's clear that the opinion makers at the time actually thought United States as a partner that Korea could work afterwards in a very, very close and in a very desirable way. I don't have to mention that our alliances between Korea and the United States has been the foundation for our economic growth, prosperity, and security on the Korean Peninsula. Without that, Korea never could have emerged as a kind of influential 13th largest economic power in the global community. And based on that alliances, we could democratize ourselves, and we could make our economy prosperous. And from that, we have diversified our relations. And in this 21st century, we have a lot of other challenges, which will be a little bit different from the challenges we faced during the 1950s, 60s, 70s. We have a lot of global issues now. Terrorism, we should tackle with the challenges that is, including the terrorism, climate change, developments, piracy, and non-proliferation. Those are really big and challenging issues. But United States and Korea had a very long-standing way of cooperating and way of working together. So we too will be very beneficial and very cooperative in dealing with the regional and global issues coming from our close cooperations on the issues relating with Korean Peninsula. So we are doing in that way, and I hope that Korea and the U.S. will be an exemplar alliance relationship in the future also.
Thank you. Let me go just one more round on the question, because I think it's good answers to lay the foundation for us. And there are many people here who know a lot about U.S. and Korea, and then there are many people who are students who don't maybe necessarily know as much, so that you're setting the context is quite helpful. But let me ask you to play the what-if game just for a second. Again, this is hard to do. So we now are 4 years from today. So we know in the future. And in the future, we discover, we learn that the Korean-U.S. relationship has soured in some significant way. So that if we were describing it today, we would say it's okay. But now it's 4 years from now, and it's a C-. It's just somehow it went awry. What could possibly happen, or what are the things? Because, and the reason for asking is just to ask, what are therefore things we should attend to? We were talking at lunch today about the free trade agreement. So, if for whatever reason that goes sour, it's a negative. It's not enough to sour the whole relationship. But just what if we were saying 2 or 3 things that we should at least be conscious of, not even likely things, but that if they happened, would have or could have significant consequences?
Because I have been working at that time in the government, so I should rather say something on that kind of if questions. I agree that there is some kind of perception of lack of real close cooperations between the United States and Korea. But it's very hard for me to agree totally that it was totally out of context. What I'm saying is that during that period, actually, the dispatching of Korean troops into Iraq to work together with the United States was made. Not exactly the United States, but with the global community. And Korea's level of troops was the 3rd largest one. And also, economically, we made a free trade agreements, which is a really very difficult and long, drawn-out process. But it was based on the foundations that our relationship is very, very important and crucial. And also the relocation of our alliances, like moving the relocation of U.S. troops into Pyeongtaek area, which is a little bit to the south of Seoul, which is not too close to North Korea and near the demilitarized zone. So when we look at the particular, I should say, performances or projects that had been undertaken, if we look at from that perspective, it may be hard to say that the relations was bad, so things might have gone in a very, very wrong direction. That is based on the very, very fundamental notion on the part of, not only on the part of Korean government, but also on the part of Korean people, that Korea-U.S. relations cannot be swayed with 1 or 2 events or 1 or 2 perceptions. Although there may be some difficult time from the perspective of perceptions, the consensus within Korea knows that the majority of the opinions is that Korea-U.S. relations is the fundamental. There may be some lack of communications concerning, for example, concerning the rapprochement with North Korea, but that rapprochement also could be undertaken because we know that Korea-U.S. alliance is strongly put in place, and we have a good military strength in case any provocations can be made. So this may not be the direct answer to the if question, but what I'm emphasizing is that never in our Korean history has Korea-U.S. relations been underestimated or disregarded it was always central to our foreign policy. It was central to our partnership policy. It was the regional one, and it was also in compliance with our global strategy for Korea.
I would just add that for all the reasons that Ambassador Han has laid out, I think we do have a U.S.-Korea relationship today, and I believe going forward that is maybe less brittle and far more resilient than it ever has been, based on not just shared interests but shared values. That said, it is a very complex relationship, and I would cite three areas where I think we have to always be mindful and be careful to make sure that we keep it on track. One is clearly in the economic area. I arrived in Korea last year just as the financial crisis was beginning. I think it was very important that we be clear from the outset that we were going to work together and that the answer to the crisis was not protectionism. And we need to be careful going forward because we have a big economic relationship and we need to manage that properly. A second area, of course, is North Korea. As allies and friends and as a country that's been so involved in the Republic of Korea's modern history, I think we as Americans always need to be sensitive to the aspirations of the Korean people for a Korean peninsula that is whole, free, and at peace, and be very respectful of the role of the Korean people in realizing that. And I hope and believe that we are doing that. And I think the third area is recognizing that as we do have a large presence on the Korean peninsula in terms of our, as you mentioned, 28,000 troops, a large military presence, we need to always be good neighbors and good friends and manage that relationship carefully. And again, I think we're doing all that, but we never take those things for granted, and we need to continue to work on them every day.
Well, I thank you, and I'd say, I mean, my takeaway from this, which is what I thought, but it gives me even greater confidence that this is an extremely solid relationship. So that's good news. Now, let me move on to North Korea, which I study and which I regard as an extremely puzzling, difficult case. So the question, to put it bluntly, is: could Kim Jong-il plausibly imagine, that he could sell a nuclear bomb to somebody like Osama bin Laden, who brought us 9/11, and get away with it? So to put that in context, so North Korea now has about 10 bombs worth of plutonium. It's conducted a couple of tests. And I look and say, could Kim Jong-il imagine that he could sell a Yongbyon-style nuclear reactor to Syria? So this is something 10,000 times bigger than a nuclear bomb, and get away with it. And I would say, of course, he could never imagine that. But of course he did. So now I'm thinking, well, what else could he imagine he could do and get away with?
Well, I will not be so bold as to try to imagine what Kim Jong-il might imagine. But I do think that because of the provocative acts that the North Korean leadership has taken not only over the last few months, but the pattern of isolation and threat and provocation that has characterized the regime for decades, we need to speak with a very serious and clear message to the leadership in North Korea, the leadership in Pyongyang. And we means not only the United States, but clearly the Republic of Korea and the other countries of the region and indeed of the international community. And that's why I think it was so important that the UN Security Council pass, as it did recently, the second resolution and a much strengthened resolution to send a message that I think even in Pyongyang, whatever your receivers are, you would get that we speak with one voice on this when it comes to our view on the need for North Korea to live up to its commitments made in 2005 and at other times to abandon its nuclear programs and to join the international community in a more responsible way.
I think
Well, you had this sit as prime minister looking at these people pretty carefully, yes?
it is very clear that North Korea is quite unpredictable, you know, state agent, if I may say. So that is why the developments of nuclear weapons is actually causing a lot of concerns from Korea, from other members in the Northeast Asia, and from global community. Definitely that North Korea is a very, very poor state and failed economically. Of course, after 60 years of different regimes, actually, South Korea, democratic and market-oriented economy, while it's a totally centrally planned economy under quite Stalinistic regime. So we know what is the difference in the outcomes of the pursuit of 60 years of that different regime. So it's clear that open society and open economy is the solutions to the developments in the future. Now, I think North Korea may adopt it, the developments of nuclear weapons, as one of the last, the things they can cling to in view of those failed situations of their economies and poor living standards of North Korean people. And also they are quite predictable if we see from the past behaviors of the North Korean regime. They may, of course, I cannot imagine what Kim Jong-il is imagining himself, of course, but they may say that it is in their long-term interest and it is their long-term strategy to behave they had actually did in the past several years, but it's a clear danger and instability on the Korean Peninsula and in the northeastern region and to the global community, because I think they are so unpredictable. So if situations allows, it is very hard for us to imagine the things that they will not do at whatever the cost. So it's a very dangerous, situations there. So then the question is whether we can contain them and we can let them be persuaded to be denuclearized. It will not be a very simple issue and very difficult issues in view of their past behaviors and all the provocations. But the international community cannot just sit on the bench. We are united now, and with the UN, we are working together, and even China and Russia are joining in the sanctions efforts. All those efforts has a clear objectives. The first one, denuclearization in North Korea. The second one, the stakeholders should participate in the talks that will be related with the denuclearization, because the five stakeholders actually have all their own national interest related with North Korean nuclear ambitions. And the third one, we should really be careful this time so that denuclearization should be the objective, not just the coming back into the talks cannot be the thing we would like to achieve. The final end game should be the denuclearization of North Korea. So these sanctions will clearly be effective in containing them and let them recalculate what they can get from this denuclearization. So these sanctions and dialogue, the two-track approach, is quite essential for us to persuade North Korea and to let North Korea think that what is the best possible way for their prosperity, for their security when they live with the international community.
extending that, or just picking up where you left off to the question, so as we now think about our strategy or approach to North Korea and its nuclear challenge. So I stand back from the scene and look at the last 8 years. So 8 years ago, President Bush came to office, 8.5, announced that the objective was CVID, complete, verifiable, irreversible elimination, or disarmament, or
denuclearization.
Denuclearization, thank you. So CVID. And South Korea said, yeah, absolutely, we agree. And the 5 parties, yes, we agree. Now,
And North Korea agreed.
and North Korea
In 2005.
And North Korea was perfectly happened to agree to say that they agreed.
Okay.
To say they agreed.
In
So-
the documents, they agreed.
Yeah, to sign that they agreed. But if I'm just keeping a scorecard here, the score seems to be what it is. And I would say the score is, for the past 8 years, North Korea 8, U.S. and South Korea 0. So North Korea has 8 more bombs than it had when this started, when we said CVID, and 2 tests. And we've worked hard, and we didn't talk, and then we talked, and we sanctioned, and we didn't sanction, and we sanctioned more. And so I would say that the question is, if we look at the record of what we tried to do, stating an ambitious objective is a good idea, but not sufficient. It hasn't worked for this period. So are there some lessons we can take from what we've tried to do in the past 8 years that, for our strategy now, so that if we meet again 4 years from now, the score is not 2 or 3 more bombs for North Korea and us 0?
Well, I mean, first of all, I guess I would, I'd take a slightly different time scale and perspective to keeping score on the Korean Peninsula. And, I mean, not to take issue,
please,
but
please,
this is a very challenging
please.
problem. But I would say that as we look at the overall situation on the Korean Peninsula, one of the great successes, of course, of the U.S.-Korea alliance is providing a kind of security shield behind which the extraordinary economic, social, political flowering of the Republic of Korea has taken place. So by any measure, that's a success.
Right.
Now, when it's come to North Korea's nuclear program, and also to the fact that, again, we have in a part of the world which has experienced really unparalleled economic opportunity and growth, and of course here I'm not just talking about the Republic of Korea, but about neighboring states like China, Mongolia, Russia. The anomaly remains North Korea and how we deal with it. Yes, I think there are a lot of lessons that we can and indeed must learn, not only from the last 8 years, but from the last couple of decades. I think that the goal, however, must remain the same. There's no reason to lower our sights. I cannot conceive of any way in which a Korean peninsula with nuclear arms or some kind of nuclear arms race in Northeast Asia is something we can live with or should live with. That has to remain our goal. And as Ambassador Han said, indeed, the DPRK has signed up to that goal. We need to keep at it. But what lessons can we learn from the last several years? I think you see that we have tried to apply those lessons as we have gone forward in going to the United Nations, in insisting on a targeted sanction that will really try to get at the problems we have with the leadership in North Korea, because we don't have a problem with the people of North Korea. They have enough problems already. And we need to be very mindful that there's a very large humanitarian dimension to this issue as well. But I think we do have a sanctions regime in place that can be successful in bringing pressure. Bringing pressure not for its own sake, because sanctions are not the end in themselves, they're the means of the end. And the end is to create I'm thinking of some Kennedy School jargon here.
Okay,
so create
good.
some new choices. Create a new context for better choices by the North Korean leadership back into a dialogue. And we do think, and one of the lessons we do draw from the last few years, is the way we do that is not by the U.S. taking this problem on all by itself, although clearly we have a very important role to play. Other countries need to be involved too, notably China, and of course, obviously, the Republic of Korea. But I think we're on the right track now, and I think we'll have to see how it goes. But I think we've seen in the last few months that these efforts we've made and enforcing the sanctions and have caught the attention of the leadership in North Korea, and we will continue to insist that dialogue is the way forward and to keep that path open.
Well, I think there is some fundamental differences in that kind of negotiations between North Korea and the other 5 parties. 5 parties are more or less somewhat democratic-oriented country. Of course, some members are not, but they are subject to some of the public opinions and also some of the, pluralistic political regime. Sometimes it'll be hard under that kind of regimes to put the appropriate structure of policies which will be effective to score some points, I should say. So this time I think we are in a rather plausible setting. That is, we have the sanctions in place. In 2006, after the first nuclear test, there was the sanctions 1718 at UN Security Council, but North Korea immediately came back to the dialogue table, and the sanctions were actually not put in place. So it was just a letter, signed. Nothing has been done. That's a very important experience we got, and this time, 1874. This is a new sanctions put in place in June, and it is being implemented. And the purpose, of course, is for these sanctions to work for the denuclearization of North Korea. And what is important is that this time, for the implementation of the sanctions, China and Russia, of course, are participated in adopting that resolutions for the sanctions, but also they are very active in implementing that, whose, the capabilities put together, 5 countries' capabilities put together is a huge thing for North Korea to deter that kind of provocations and let them go toward the denuclearization. But at the same time, with that sanctions, we are going in the direction of dialogue. These sanctions will contain them, the non-proliferation things, denuclearization things, not at the at the final stage. But if those are combined with dialogue, I think that'll be quite effective, and we can get the effects that we didn't get in the previous 2005, 2006. So we are very serious this time, and we are united this time, and all the stakeholders are really standing on the same footing.
Well, it's a tough one, and I appreciate both candid answers. I would say, myself, having studied it for some time, I've been quite skeptical of our approach. I think it's almost predictably led to the score that we achieved, and I wish we would achieve a better score, but I don't quite see how the current strategy is going to produce much different. And unfortunately, I don't have a much better idea. I mean, it would be terrific to say, oh, and boy, do I have a great idea. Instead of doing this, do that. But I sometimes think we should try to put ourselves in the shoes of Kim Jong-il and the ruling group and say, how are they looking at this situation? And I think he looks and says, 8 years ago, George Bush came to power. He said first he was going to bury me, that we were going to collapse the regime. And then he said we're going to have CVID. And now, excuse me, I had 2 bombs then, I have 10 now. I had no tests then, I have 2. I'm still here, he's gone. What's wrong with this picture? And you and I would say, well, but look at the miserable conditions under which people live in North Korea, which is horrible, horrible. I don't think most of the regime spends much time worrying about that. They seem to worry about control, but they don't mind, or they don't seem to care about starving, their own people. So it's a horrible regime. So it's a little bit like trying to deal with a mafioso crowd, which I think is a first approximation. And mostly we're nicer, and mafioso guys are pretty tricky and pretty tough. So if they'll say, oh, of course, we'll sign up to anything. I mean, I think he would sign up to anything. I don't think he would fulfill anything. So I'm feeling I'm hopeful that something will change, but I'm feeling that we're seeing almost the de facto emergence of a nuclear weapons state, which I agree is unacceptable, and the consequences of which for the stability of the whole region, I think would be hugely, hugely negative. So a great challenge for Kennedy School students. If you can think of a better idea, you can become famous. I wish I had a better idea, so this is not like, oh, right. What about this alternative? And I don't want to be too pessimistic, but I'd say we've had maybe, if you go back and look at the Institute of Politics website for forums, we've had probably a half dozen forums on North Korea or on the Korean issue and nuclear issues before, with Chris Hill when he was here and others. And we always are optimistic, but each time the score gets worse.
Well, if I may say that, I think you're absolutely right to observe that from having said that, I don't want to put myself too much in the mind of Kim Jong-il, but I think you're absolutely right to emphasize that from the perspective of Pyongyang, their ability to develop this nuclear program is a great achievement. I mean, they say that, and they're very proudly. This is what defines them as a successful nation.
Maybe their only success, or plus surviving. Yeah.
But I think the challenge, but perhaps where I don't think we should, underestimate, don't overestimate, not underestimate, the cost, and I mean the cost in every sense of this program for them. And I think the challenge for us is how do we keep making that cost higher, and can we eventually make it too high for them? And it's not easy, but I think we're on the right track in trying to do that.
But what is very interesting is that because of all these provocations and the scoring by North Korea of 8, as you said, that actually united the international community. So when the resolution 1874 was adopted in June 13th, at the UN, possibly I think some of the members of UN might have thought that if they favor the resolution, adoption of the resolutions, they may be somewhat against North Korea. If they do, they are somewhat, in favor of North Korea. But now, with all the provocations in April, May, now the whole international community is now firmly believes that the adoption of the resolution of the sanctions is not just whether you like North Korea or not. It's a kind of international cause that they should stick to. That's why China, Russia joins in, and that's why in the implementation of that 1874, United Arab Emirates, which may be totally unrelated with North Korean issue, actually interdicted the ship which carries the arms, manufactured by North Korea for Iran. These kind of things will make hopefully, North Korea recalculate their strategy of going in this way. Of course, it's not complete, and it's not the whole thing that actually can be implied by that, but the international community's united front is really meaning something to North Korea. And United States and Korea, of course, are center at that united front.
We've now come to the opportunity for participants in the audience to ask questions. There are 4 microphones, 2 here on the ground floor and 2 in the loges. The procedures are as follows. First, introduce yourself, and if you're a student here or a fellow or whatever, say your affiliation. Second, state your question succinctly. And third, make sure a question mark comes at the end. Okay? And we'll start with this gentleman, please.
Thank you so much for your wonderful talks. My name is Yong-Wook Liu. I'm doing a PhD in the Political Science Department here at Harvard. So whenever we talk about North Korea, we inevitably end up talking about North Korean nuclear weapons. Right? And that's understandable because the issue is very important. But I think we should also move away from the nuclear issue, focusing only on nuclear issue, to the problem of North Korea in general. Right? So I'd like to ask my question for both ambassadors. Is there a clear vision and thinking on the part of both governments about possible or potential post-unification scenarios on the Korean Peninsula? Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your question. I agree with you. When we talk about the future of North Korea, we need to talk about a lot more than the question of nuclear weapons. This is a society that faces many, many challenges. First of all, in terms of talking about and planning for the future, yes, that is something that we are doing both within our own governments and as allies. In terms of our vision, and a vision for a post-unification Korea, I mean, first of all, I would say as a non-Korean, that is fundamentally a question for the Korean people. And as President Obama underscored when he met with President Lee in June, the U.S. wants to see a peaceful reunification of Korea under the principles of democracy and the kind of economy that has brought success to the Republic of Korea. Our vision, though, I think if you look at the joint statement of September 2005, which again North Korea also signed, there's a lot more in there than the dismantlement of Korea's nuclear program, which is a fundamental of it. There is a vision there of North Korea being able to normalize its relations, and certainly we would see a denuclearized North Korea in a normal and healthy relationship with the United States of America, with Japan, a near neighbor and the second largest economy in the world, and in a position to receive the kind of energy and economic assistance that will help it to take its rightful place in the international community and in the region.
Yes, for Korean government, we made very clear several times that we are ready to help North Korea if North Korea has the intention to denuclearize. Of course, the timing which should come first may be discussed at the six-party talks in any multilateral and bilateral forums within the multilateral forums. But it's clear that without North Korea's abandoning the nuclear weapons and ambitions, all those kind of international community support will be useless, and at the same time, they may not be effective. So at the six-party talks and any dialogue we will have within the six-party talks, we will try to persuade North Korea to exactly understand that and our intention. In that sense, we are open to dialogue. We are open to help with North Korea's intentions to abandon the nuclear ambitions, which was actually the agreements in September 19th, agreements at six-party talks in 2005. Even we are undertaking now some projects about 30 kilometers from Seoul in Kaesong, which is an industrial zone. There, 100 Korean companies are operating, employing 40,000 North Korean workers. And it's huge amount of employment. And that is, I hope, will be a very good symbolic cooperation projects between North and South Korea. But measure more additional cooperation projects can be executed really with some of the cooperation and response from North Korea. That is, they should really be serious about the denuclearization, which is a real destabilizing factor on the Korean Peninsula and in Northeast Asia and globally by their proliferation.
Go to the gentleman in the loge, please. Yes.
Hi, I'm Dave Tier. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. First, I want to say thanks for taking the time to talk to us today. Very interesting topic. My question is, during the Clinton administration, 1990s, the United States negotiated an agreement with North Korea to stop producing nuclear weapons and denuclearize the peninsula. My question is, since North Korea continued to secretly continue their nuclear weapons program, do you think the present administration is in any danger of creating another agreement which would give us a false sense of security?
Well, I think I would repeat what I said earlier, which is I hope we can learn lessons from the recent past. I would say that many of the officials involved in the Obama administration with this issue had experience during the Clinton administration and remember it well. Painful experience in many ways, as some people here today will also recall. And that's why we put an emphasis on the idea of verification. And if you recall, at the end of last year, that's where we reached an obstacle which proved very difficult, well, impossible to overcome, over the issue of verification. Secretary of Defense Gates has said that we're not going to buy the same horse twice. And maybe that's a nice, homely way of saying we have learned a few things, and we think we're on the right track now, but we will constantly remind ourselves of what we have learned from experience.
Please.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. My name is Yi Jung-hoon. I'm a first-year student at the Harvard Law School. My question relates to Ambassador Stevens' thoughts about increasing the cost of maintaining the nuclear program in North Korea. And I find that troubling for a few reasons. To me, the only reason the international community is interested in North Korea right now is because they have a nuclear weapon. So no price, I don't think any cost would be too high for North Korea unless they're at the brink of collapse. So don't we have to up the ante? Don't we have to offer a little bit more than just say, like, we just wait until the sanctions work and they're too desperate that they have to give it up? I mean, I don't think that's very likely. And I also would like to add that it would be naive to say that we, and by we I mean the Korea-US alliance, isn't thinking that. So my question would rather be, how much are we going to up the ante by and when? Like, under what conditions would they be?
Well, thank you very much. And I do want to emphasize again that, that sanctions are not an end in themselves. They are a means to an end. And that's why we continue to not only talk about the fact that the path of dialogue remains open, but also to consult about it with others who are involved in the process. That's why Ambassador Steve Bosworth has been traveling so frequently to the region to talk with his counterparts, not only in Seoul, but in Beijing, in Tokyo, and with his Russian counterparts, to talk about what is this negotiation going to look like. I mean, we do not want to see sanctions continue for a long time. We'd like to see an early return to a real process of dialogue and an affirmation that we do want to implement what we agreed to 3 years ago. I would also just add, I think when it comes certainly to the United States, and I think it's clear that the Republic of Korea as well, that we have a deep interest in seeing North Korea have a different future and a better future. And it's not a matter of, they need to have nuclear weapons somehow to get our attention. I mean, they have our attention. We've got 28,000 troops in the Republic of Korea. We work together closely. We want to see a different and better future for the DPRK. And we've made that clear time and time again, and we will continue to. And we hope that that will quickly, sooner rather than later, bring them to the table of dialogue and negotiation.
I just would like to compliment that her remarks that the dialogue which will discuss the denuclearization of North Korea and anything that can be related with that and the sanctions of UN may not be totally exclusive one. This is the first time that there is an agreement by the international community that sanctions which contain the proliferations and arms trading by North Korea and the serious negotiations can go together. So it's very important for us to know that North Korea is really serious about this. I don't want to give the impression that these negotiations will be easy and short-framed. It will be very, very difficult and will be drawn out. But that is we believe, the only choice we and the international community can choose.
This gentleman on the right, please.
Hi, thank you for coming here today. My name is Chris Holliday, and I'm a junior at the college. So we've discussed how one of South Korea's biggest challenges is its neighbor, North Korea. We've also discussed how the North Korean nuclear program has strengthened the country, but it also seems like it's in a very fragile state. Given Kim Jong-il's health and also the very weak economy of North Korea, what plans are the U.S. and South Korea making to confront a potential collapse of the North Korean government? And if this collapse did occur, well, what are some of the greatest challenges that we face moving forward, such as the integration of the North Korean people?
I think that, first of all, it's not very clear to know what kind of things will happen, but it's clear an obligation of any government to be prepared against the worst. So there may be some dialogue, first of all, among the scholars, what kind of things can be done and what will be the situations. So that is the preparations we should make. But that does not mean that we cannot judge at this point that when that will happen and when will be the time that we should take the real actions.
No, and I would just add that I think also we feel as allies and as a country that has important interests, we too need to be prudent in planning and being to discuss what the future, what some of the scenarios might look like. And some of that, as the ambassador said, takes place in the so-called Track 2. Discussions begin about that, but also at the government level, that's a discussion that we need to have.
I just add a small footnote from a Track 2 conversation that we've had here at the Kennedy School with the Chinese government. I've been surprised that there hasn't been enough Track 1 conversations in which, especially with Chinese Americans and South Koreans sitting down and saying, what if, and asking what would occur. Because from a Chinese perspective, it's pretty clear South Korea is going to absorb North Korea, but it's going to be pretty messy. But then that gets even more complicated because a South Korea that absorbs North Korea, whereupon a military ally of the U.S. is on the Chinese border, is, as Chinese strategists say, the reason why they entered the Korean War to start with. So they don't want us near their border. Well, we could say, well, of course they know we're not going to come up into North Korea, and then they look and say, but that's what Gorby bought, in the Soviet Union. So I think it's a good topic. It would be actually an interesting one about which somebody could write a paper, which would be useful. No, I mean it is. It's a topic that's out there because it's almost too hard for the governments to deal with because of all of all of the complexixities. But we're going to this.
Could I just add, though, it is very hard, but the other, and not to go back to your 8-0 score, but I think one beneficial outcome of the hard experience the last few years has been that the most concerned nations on this issue, that is the 6 parties or the 5, have developed a new habit of consultation and cooperation. You know, the fact that China has chaired these 6-party talks has meant that we have begun to talk with China about regional security issues in a way that we haven't before. And those relationships, I hope, will keep us in some better stead, whatever the challenges that lie ahead.
I agree completely with that point. Please, sir.
Hi, my name is Kevin Kong, and I am a freshman at Harvard College. And you might remember from last year, the United States and Republic of Korea signed a major trade agreement in which Korea resolved to import a lot of meat of questionable character. And you may be aware that it was met with a lot of protest, there was a lot of backlash, and a lot of controversy. How has that affected the diplomatic relations between the United States and Korea, or the trade dynamics between the two nations?
I think his backlash and all the oppositions may mean Korea, right? Not the United States. Okay, so we had very much difficulties in negotiating the free trade agreements with the United States. But I would like to say that it's an agreement that actually enhance the economic partnership between Korea and the United States. So we can call it economic partnership agreements, which means we eliminate the tariffs and non-tariff barriers and strengthen the investors' rights so that there can be some kind of economic alliance between Korea and the United States. So I would like to call it, another alliance which will strengthen our already existing military and multidimensional alliance and partnership relations between South Korea and the United States. So it is very crucial, and all the policymakers in Washington agrees to that it is important to both countries. But some kind of dialogue may be necessary because there are some concerns on the part of Congress and administration that although this free trade agreement is aimed at addressing some of the problems and imbalances between the two economies in terms of trade and investment, still there are some concerns that some more needs to be done. So our 2 trade ministers of 2 countries began their dialogue from May, and they are in the process of discussing what can be done to chart a way forward. So I think that good results will be made, and I'm hopeful that because it is such an important agreement, the largest agreement after NAFTA 16 years ago, that they will be approved by both the National Assembly and Congress of Korea and the United States.
Thank you. Please, the lady in the, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for being with us here today. My name is Pek Chi-eun. I'm a senior government concentrator here at the college. I have a short question today, which is what kind of speculations or expectations or action plans, if any, do the 2 governments have with regard to the projected change in leadership in North Korea in the next several years?
Well, again, I think that going back to a point we've made a little bit earlier, I think we all recognize that it's only prudent and our responsibility to try to think through what some of the scenarios might be in the region over the next few years. But it's not something that we really talk about very publicly, but I do think it's something that is not only for governments, but is also very informed by the kind of scholarly and track 2 discussions that might also take place, and it's very useful when they involve scholars from other countries as well, and not just one. But so basically, I think we just need to keep thinking about it.
I agree.
Okay. This gentleman on the right, thank you.
Walter Clemens, Boston University and the Davis Center here. Question about the possibility of more intense bilateral talks between the United States and North Korea. A South Korean newspaper just yesterday reported that the other interlocutors have agreed that the U.S. and North Korea should talk more, somehow in the context of the 6-party talks, but maybe taking a bigger role than they have in the past. Professor Allison asked before, what could go wrong in the bilateral relationship between Washington and Seoul? Ambassador Han, is it possible that South Korea would become so upset about a U.S.-North Korean deal that the relationship between the United States and South Korea would somehow suffer? And Ambassador Stevens, could you explain why the reluctance on the part of the United States to talk more directly, or even to accept some sort of relationship where each side would have, where Pyongyang would have representation in Washington, in the U.S., in Pyongyang? Is North Korea somehow worse than East Germany, or Mao Zedong's China, or Stalin's Soviet Union, that we're unwilling to have diplomatic relations with them? So, question about bilateral.
Two easy questions, please.
Well, Korea supports the bilateral dialogue between the United States and North Korea with 3 contexts. One, that dialogue should contribute to the denuclearization of North Korea, and the dialogue should expedite and should be made within the context of the 6-party talks. And possibly the dialogue can go with some of the international actions that may be necessary for North Korea to recalculate their options. So in that sense, there's a very close consultations between South Korea and the United States, not only between us, but also among stakeholders, which are Japan, China, and Russia. So this bilateral dialogue will be done within the 6-party frameworks, and it will help the denuclearization of North Korea. And it will be done with, if necessary, with the implementation of UN actions.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've tried to be very clear that we are open, and we certainly will be necessary and important to have a bilateral U.S. DPRK dialogue in the context of a return to the 6-party talks and a return to an implementation of what we all agreed to in denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula and transforming the region. Transforming the peninsula as agreed to in 2005. Now, within that agreement in 2005 we keep referring to, we talk about normalization of relations. We talk about having a working group, and that's a bilateral discussion between the U.S. and Pyongyang. There's also a parallel bilateral discussion envisioned between Japan and Pyongyang. We would like to see that. Now, we tried, in terms of your question about normalization of diplomatic relations, in the 1990s, as part of our effort then, the U.S. And North Korea tried to work towards some kind of beginning of a liaison office or some kind of exchange of relations. That unfortunately broke down, but not for any reluctance on the part of the U.S. In fact, I know a couple of people who were very disappointed they weren't able to go and serve. But certainly, if we can get this process going again, that's what we'd like to see, and that's what's envisioned.
Gentleman in the loge, please.
I think she was first.
Oh, okay, then why don't we take this lady and then you, please.
Simon Chan, Assistant Professor at Suffolk University, and it's truly a pleasure to hear both ambassadors. And I still remember my excitement of when I heard that Ambassador Stevens being nominated, and especially, looking her background, I thought, oh my God, this is like a perfect background to serve as ambassador. Now, I would like to follow up on the student's question about Chorus FTA. Very quick question. What are the prospects? From 4 years from now, will there be a Chorus FTA? Second follow-up that question is, what are the obstacles? I'm saying this because I actually myself was on a panel organized by the KEI, presented at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars on June 8th. And there actually, I made an argument where linking sort of trade and security together. That is the reason the importance of course FTA has something to do with when we're seeking the new sort of paradigm to, so permanent peace and security in the Korean Peninsula. That is the reason why course FTA had met a lot of resistance. It has something to do with also there are a lot of very strong what you call national liberationists in South Korea who is very concerned about the divided Korea and all those, pain and affliction and the suffering. So if you really look at those people who protested against the course FTA, those people who organized, I interviewed, a lot of them too. What I found was they were really interested in this really, truly sort of a more improved relationship between North and South and North and United States. Now, so here is I think the alternative that I think that we should think about it. We should really push for the course FTA, linking that issue with a permanent security, improve the relationship between North and United States, North and South Korea. So going back to my question, so will there be course FTA 4 years from now, and what are the obstacles, and what are you doing to make that happen? Thank you.
Please.
Well, I mean, from the U.S. perspective, clearly, President Obama has clearly stated, the administration clearly understands this is a very big and important agreement. It's important for both countries. It's important for the United States not only on economic terms, but because of the strategic implications for continued American presence and leadership in the region. And we all know Asia is of increasing importance not only to the United States but to the world. So we want to find a way forward. And that is what the Obama administration is seeking as it looks to stakeholders. There are concerns in the United States, particularly from the auto industry and some other stakeholders. And as the Obama administration, with the very big agenda it had coming into office, with the financial crisis and the other things that it has been dealing with, is doing this fall, is looking for comments from stakeholders. In fact, until September 15th on the Federal Register, comments have been invited, and of course they will be welcome anytime. But I think that once those comments are in on the Federal Register, then the U.S. Trade Representative Ron Kirk will be looking very closely at what makes the most sense, because clearly with all the other economic and financial issues we're looking at, we have to find the right politics to push it forward in the United States. But President Obama has committed himself to looking carefully at what the concerns are of stakeholders here, seeing if there are some areas where we want to go back in the auto sector or elsewhere, given all that's happened, the turmoil in the auto industry in the United States, where we need to go back and have another look, and then after that, charting the way forward.
We hope definitely to put the agreement into effect earlier than 4 years. Definitely, I hope that it be finalized as early as possible. For that, the leaders of the two countries and also the leaders of the National Assembly of Korea and Congress of the United States should work together, and our administration also should try to allay some of the sectoral concerns that are actually raised by those stakeholders.
So, unfortunately, we're coming to the end. We have only time for one last question.
Okay.
The gentleman in the lodge who was so polite. It was short question and short answers, please.
Okay. My name is Faustino John Lim, and I'm a student at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Okay. It's an honor to meet both of you and to be here. I would like to, Ambassador Stephen, you mentioned earlier about the growing cooperation with China in the six-party talks. I wanted to ask what your opinions or your perspectives on the prospects of cooperation with China and also the limits of your cooperation with China in the six-party talks.
Mm-hmm. I think China, over the last couple of years, and again, despite some of the setbacks, to put it mildly, that we've suffered in our efforts to use the six-party talks for denuclearization and normalization on the Korean Peninsula, China has taken an increasing sense of ownership in its part in the process as the chair. I think that its role there has contributed to our efforts within the U.S.-China relationship to encourage China to be, in the words of a former administration official, be a responsible stakeholder in the world. And I think we need to continue to work on it. The Obama administration has just had its first session of its version of kind of our strategic or senior dialogue with China that was begun under the previous administration. There is continuity in a lot of areas of foreign policy, and this sense that we have so many issues with China. It's such a huge and important relationship. We really need to figure out every way we can to really increase our understanding of where we're coming from, and we want to encourage China to play its rightful role and its responsible role, commensurate with its clout, its economic clout and growing presence in the region. And North Korea and its role there is clearly a part of it. So that's an ongoing thing. That's an ongoing thing that is very important as we go forward.
So it's to me to conclude. I'm not going to try to summarize. I think we've had a terrific conversation in which we've seen lots of the angles, but I think we've been especially honored to have two such outstanding ambassadors spend this much time with us. And so let's please say thank you very much.